everybody. So today's theme, of course, wonder of wonders. And that story will unfold, I hope, as we progress a little. And let me start with this small reading. Now, I'm always a little cautious, and as I'm sure you are, when you read online something profound, and then at the bottom it says, so says the Dalai Lama, or so says Pope Francis, or so says the Buddha. And I always think, really? Where did they say that? When did they say that? I think things are attributed to these great sages that maybe shouldn't have been. But in this case, I've been very diligent in trying to source stories and information from Buddhist scholars so that I can speak with as much authority as possible. So here is one reading that I want to share with you. And this is the moment when we find Siddhartha sitting under the Bodhi tree. And the story goes like this. An astrologer of great proficiency in his trade came for a bath in the river and saw a footprint on the riverbank. There are observations through which, by looking at the way one's feet are, someone can predict exactly what he or she will do. The astrologer saw that this was the footprint of an emperor, someone who should rule the world. Then he wondered, why would such a person be in this remote place near a jungle? So he followed the footprint, thinking he will meet an emperor. Then he saw this monk, Gautama, sitting under a tree. He looked at this and thought, either my astrology has gone all wrong, or I am being fooled, or I'm in some kind of hallucination. What's happening here? So he went to Gautama and said, who are you? And Gautama said, I am nobody. I am just nobody. But you have the feet of an emperor. You should conquer the world, said the astrologer. Well, that I will, said Gautama, but not by conquest. There are two ways, he said, you can have the world, either by conquest or inclusion. Both ways, something or someone becomes yours. But if you go by conquest, it will always be a pain in your neck. But if you include, this will become a great enhancement of life. So yes, he said, I am the emperor of the world. And the astrologer said, but you're a monk. You own nothing. I own nothing, said Gautama, and I am a nobody. And that is why everything is mine. So allow me to spend a few moments in the company of this man who was born 2,500 years ago, approximately. They can't exactly pin the date, in a small kingdom just below the Himalayas. When he was born obviously to a ruler, a monarch, and the son thereof. And a Brahmin visited the king at the time and prophesied that his son, the boy, would become a universal monarch or a great sage. And his father, terrified that he would become a sage and throw away all of his princeliness, said, I'm going to completely surround my son and seal him off from the rest of the world and only show him luxury and the best that life can offer. So that included the very best teachers. He was adept at so many skills and sports. when he was of the marrying age, he married a young lady called Gopa, and they had a son. But as the story goes, something as persistent as his shadow drew him into the world. And one day, while his family, his son and wife were sleeping, he slipped out of the castle and into the surrounding town outside of the walls of his kingdom, his castle, sorry. And in that brief time, he saw three things that were about to change his life and ultimately ours. He saw a sick man, an old man, and a corpse. And these things, of course, were showing him aspects of life that he had never experienced before: sickness, aging, and death, and suffering. And then he passed a wandering ascetic who was dressed in robes and carrying a bowl for alms. And this inspired him to say, I want that. And so in the twinkling of an eye, he turned his back on all that luxury that his father had fought so hard for him to have. He slipped out of the confines of this life and became himself a wandering ascetic. And at that time in Indian culture and society, if you were that way inclined, if you were a Brahmin or you had spiritual yearnings, very often you went into the forests. And of course, it didn't take him long to find a forest literally teeming with a myriad of teachers of a variety of methods. And he literally went from teacher to teacher to teacher to teacher, learning, learning, listening, listening, experiencing, experiencing. And he found himself two main teachers and spent some significant time with them. The first one was this. The first teacher taught him that the learning of the discipline of the mind was the way to enter into the sphere of nothingness. And he pursued this, but in doing so realized, I feel no liberation from the things that I've seen, the suffering, the sickness, the aging, the death. So he changed teachers and he found another teacher. And this teacher taught him that to enter a state between consciousness and non-consciousness, and in that sweet spot, he would find what he was looking for. And he pursued it and pursued it and pursued it. And when he got there, realized, no, I still don't feel the liberation that I seek. So he then left the forest, was joined by 5 other wandering ascetic people, and they joined it and made a band of 6 of them. And they entered a life of austerity. And it got to the point that it was so austere that he was literally eating just 1 grain of rice. As I said, pursuing this deep, deep, deep learning to find the liberation that he sought. And he was pitting, and they were pitting their mind against body. But after 6 years, he decided that he wanted to abandon this. And his companions were so shocked at this desire of his that they abandoned him and left him alone. And now alone, he decided, I'm going to go in search of food. And he went into the neighboring town and met a woman called Sujata, who very famously offered him 2 things, a dish of milk and a vessel of honey. And then, feeling full and feeling satisfied for the first time in 6 years, he bathed himself in the river, and from the river there was a dead stick floating, and it carried him to the other side of the other bank. And as he crawled up the bank, he saw what would become known, as we know, the Bodhi tree. And he said, that's it. I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to move. So he was literally solid and unmoving. And after 6 days of sitting in that position under that tree, as we know, the story tells us, he saw the rising morning star, and in this moment, his eyes were opened. And he is reported to have said, in this moment of great revelation, wonder of wonders. Before I get to that, I do want to tell you the next part of the journey. And in this revelation that he was having, he saw that what would become known as the first noble truth. The Sanskrit word is dukkha, which means suffering, pain, dissatisfaction. And even here in our lives, 2,500 years later, we know exactly the truth of these words. There is suffering, death, pain, dissatisfaction all around us, but also, of course, within us. But then he realized that the dukkha was a noble truth, an emphasis on the noble, because he said it is, in fact, our stepping stone. That our human condition is that which brings about suffering and craving and thirsting for pleasure. And the idea of self, as Cecil was saying earlier, of being separate from all that is. So only when this was realized could you then enter into the third noble truth, which was the cessation of suffering. And his revelation, as we know, brought about the incredible teaching of the Eightfold Path. And we don't have time to touch upon that today, but perhaps in another gathering we can, because it is very profound. So what is the wonder of wonders? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But first, 3 short stories that I've gathered from the scholars of his life and his teachings. And the first one is this. And I think in true story parable style, I won't do any of the explaining because, of course, this is our personal journey to sit with it and see what resonates and what truth it has for us. But this is the first story. At this point in his life, of course, now he had assembled disciples. And wandering into the circle that he of sitting around with his disciples came a devotee of Rama. Now, when we talked about Gandhi a few months ago, as you know, his mantra was Rama, 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 the word for the divine. And this devotee said to the Buddha, I've been chanting this. He was an old man. I've been chanting this my whole life, he said. And there are so many who don't believe in God. And I want to know, Buddha, oh, by the way, I didn't mention this, but Buddha, Bu, B-U, means intellect, and Buddha means above the intellect. So he said to the Buddha, is there a God? And the Buddha said the first definitive thing that his disciples had ever heard him say, and allegedly he said, no. And this, of course, caused great confusion amongst the disciples. And they were like, what are we doing? Why are we wasting our time? What are you telling us? But later, as they sat with it, they almost felt a sense of relief. That in a way, if that were the truth, they didn't have to struggle anymore. that no one was spying on them, snooping on them. You can do whatever you want. And they were happy. And then the next morning, a man by the name of Chavarka, who was a materialist and atheist, feeling a little confident of himself, but also with a tinge of fear, approached the Buddha, knowing now that they were of the same mind, there is no God. And he said, so you and I agree then, Buddha, there is no God, right? And the Buddha said, but there is. And in this moment, the disciples saw the seed of the truth that he was trying to teach them, to take all that belief of yes and no, so that you can really begin the search. The second story tells of a disciple who brought a gift of flowers to the Buddha. And he was carrying them. There were so many flowers, his arms were wrapped around the bunch like this. Now, again, we've talked about it. I think we talked about it in the last gathering we were together. But as you know, there's the clean hand and the unclean hand. And as he approached the Buddha excitedly with this bunch of flowers, the Buddha looked at him and said, drop it. And the man said, oh no, my goodness, I've let my left hand touch the flowers. So he dropped those flowers that had been what he thought was soiled, now just holding them in his right hand. And the Buddha said, drop it. And he thought, my goodness, I have to drop all the flowers. But he did. And the Buddha said, no, I said, drop it, not the flowers. In other words, drop the one who brought the flowers. Otherwise, you will never know the Buddha. Yes, you will come, you will bow down, you'll listen, and then you'll go. But you will not know what it means to be with an enlightened one. And right now, what you call myself is just a bundle of thoughts, emotions, ideas, opinions, and belief systems. If you don't drop that, then what is the possibility? And then the final story, which I found very charming, and I'd love to share it with you. As you know, the ascetics and the disciples relied on alms, the gifts of strangers, to help them to survive. But this becomes particularly hard during the monsoon period, when the rains, if any of you have been to India and know, the rains are relentless and fierce. And very often they can no longer be outside or under trees. They often are hoping that people will let them stay in their homes. And with this tall, handsome monk by the name of Ananda was approached by a prostitute who said, come stay with me while the monsoons are here. And he said, oh my goodness, I don't know. This could be compromising my path. I have to go and ask the Buddha. So he ran to the Buddha and said, this prostitute wants to house me. And he said, what should I do? And the Buddha said, well, if she's inviting you, you must stay. What? And then Ananda thought to himself, well, yes, actually, what she has to offer me is more than I have. In these days with the rain, with no food, no shelter, I'll accept. And in that time during the rains, this prostitute showered him with gifts. She gave him a silk wrap instead of his dirty robe, which he gratefully received. She cooked incredibly delicious, healthy, substantial food for him every day, which he gratefully received. And in the evening, she danced for him, and he sat and watched her with the utmost attention, grateful for what she was offering him. And when the rain stopped and it was time to move on, Ananda came to Gautama with a female monk. So, wonder of wonders, what was it that he saw? It comes to this in its purest sense. It's hard to condense it down, but it simply is this, and Cecil touched on it earlier, that in that moment at the age of 35 under the tree, after all that searching and all that he was doing and pursuing and trying to appease, he realized that everything he'd been looking for had never been lost, neither to him nor to anyone else. There was, in fact, nothing to attain. There was no longer a need or a struggle to attain it. Everything that we need is within. Wonder of wonders.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.